I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Courtney Harris to our colloquium series. She's presently professor and also at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and also the chair of the Department of Physical Sciences there. Courtney got her undergraduate degree actually from the University of Virginia and did graduate work at Berkeley and also again at the University of Virginia. When she was an undergraduate, she was in applied engineering, and as a graduate student, she was in Department of Environmental Sciences, where she completed her PhD. She went on to Woods Hole and worked at the USGS there as a postdoc, and then went back to Virginia, this time as an assistant professor at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, William and Mary, and has worked there since and progressed on to being the famous person she is now in the field of three-dimensional modeling of the coastal ocean and sedimentary transport processes in the coastal ocean. She's worked both in estuarine systems in North America as well as in Asia, and I believe that she's going to talk about some of both today. And so I just will leave it there. And Courtney, welcome again. And please stay on afterwards. Don't just sign right off when you've completed your talk, because there will be a question period. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction. And thank you also for letting me give this talk remotely. Again, I'd like to thank Bob and Josie for inviting me to give this talk. And as Bob said, I'm going to be talking a bit about how we try to account for sediment processes and then enlarging our view from sediment transport, how we try to account for the effects of sediment transport on biogeochemistry in coastal oceans. So in the course of the talk, I'm going to really highlight two examples. One is offshore of the Irrawaddy Delta in Myanmar. And so I'll be going into a little bit about the background of this site and the motivation for studying sedimentary processes there. And then the other example in the second part of the talk is going to be more talking about Gulf of Mexico and how we've been working to do numerical modeling of sediment transport in the Gulf of Mexico, and then relating those sediment transport calculations to issues of biogeochemistry and contaminant transport. So the title that I gave for the talk today is Sediment Transport in Coastal Environments. And I want to really highlight the advances that we've been trying to make in numerical modeling, because that's mainly the focus of my research is developing and implementing three-dimensional numerical models in coastal systems, and then how we're applying those sediment transport models to look at interdisciplinary problems. Let's see, I don't know how to change screen. Okay, all right. So in this talk, I'm going to be highlighting the work of some former VIM student, and I'd like to acknowledge them here. So first, Matt Fair is just received his master's this past summer, and he worked on the Irrawaddy Delta project. Danielle Tarpley and Julia Moriarty both completed PhDs in my group, and Danielle worked on the cohesive sediment transport model, which is the flocculation model, and Julia worked on coupling the sediment transport model to a biogeochemical model. And I'll show some of Julia's results from Gulf of Mexico, but she also applied her sediment and biological coupling to both the offshore of the Rhone Delta and in Chesapeake Bay. And then this work has been done as part of projects that involved other VIMS colleagues, including Steve Keel. Lin Shui was a former postdoc of mine, and she worked on some of the coupling that I'll show between the sediment processes and oil. And then Carl and Margie Friedrichs have both been co-PIs on some of the projects that I'll be showing. And then finally, outside of VIMS, this work has really benefited from collaborations with the USGS, especially Chris Sherwood, and the group from CSDMS, which is the Community Surface Dynamics Modeling System, including Jaya Savitsky and Chris Jenkins. And then for the oil sediment coupling model, that was done as part of a big consortium with the main model developer in that consortium being Dmitry Dukovsky. So I just wanted to pause and acknowledge their contributions here. So the general theme of my talk then is to try to show you some updates in how we've been developing our sediment transport models, so the advancements that we have had in those numerical models, and then how we've been applying them to interdisciplinary problems. So first, I'm going to give you a bit of a background in the COAST and Cstms modeling frameworks. So that's the version of the ROMS, or Regional Ocean Modeling System, that I primarily use. And most of the applications that I show today will be using the non-cohesive version of that model. And then I'm going to have examples, as I said, from the Irrawaddy River and Northern Andaman Sea, as well as the Northern Gulf of Mexico. And then I'll close with a few thoughts on summarizing this work and what I think our future directions can be. But some of the main points I want to make is that when we work within a community model, so that means a numerical model where lots of different people contribute to different parts of the code, that allows us to really work within a larger research community and enables us to kind of couple our area of expertise. So for me, sediment transport, couple that to advances that my colleagues are making in other components of the model. And another point I want to make is that our three-dimensional numerical ocean models are really now very well able to account for suspended transport. And so since we have some confidence that we're doing a good job with suspended transport, then it is opens up the door, since we're working in a community model, to start coupling our sediment transport model to other models, such as a geochemical model. So a big guiding principle of my research kind of career and trajectory has been to try to think about delivery of materials from source to sink, or flux and fate of those materials. So this is a figure that was kind of generated from the Margins Source to Sink program. And it's showing kind of a general kind of cross-sectional view of a sedimentary system. So going from the source materials up in the uplands down to depositional locations on the continental shelves and even in the deep sea. So my own research has been focused on how the materials are modified, buried, and reworked once they get into the coastal ocean. So the primary focus of my work has been looking at material once it comes, usually I've looked at riverine systems that are dominated by river input. So looking at that fluvial material once it gets into the coastal ocean. Is it advected along shore by coastal currents and carried downstream, or is it reworked by energetic waves and currents on the continental shelf, perhaps feeding downslope transport to the deep sea? So in order to, the main way that I've tried to approach contributing to these larger source to sink issues is by developing numerical models for estuaries and continental shelves. So in order to account for the sediment transport in those shallow coastal environments, we need to be able to account for the processes that are, or the physical oceanography that is moving the sediment from its riverine source out to marine sink locations. So I often use these two schematics. One is from Don Wright's book, and then this is a schematic that was generated by Peter Turkowski and Rocky Geyer. So in Don's figure, he's showing what was thought of as the important processes for sediment dispersal at the time that he wrote the book. So he has our river putting sediment out into the coastal ocean. It's that plume is being advected to the right, both because it's being deflected by along shelf flows, and also because Coriolis is going to cause it to turn in the direction that, depending on which hemisphere you're in. Once that material gets out into the coastal ocean, any sediment or nutrients that are in that material are going to move along with the plume, but they're going to start to be diffused into the broader ocean. And if it's particulate matter, it's going to start to sink. So once it starts to settle out of the estuarine plume, we can build up bottom boundary layers that might have a lot of sediment in them when the flow is energetic enough to resuspend sediment. So the transport of a lot of sediment is going to be dominated by what's going on near the bed, because that's where our bottom boundary layer flows are going to be energetic enough to resuspend material. So in Don's figure, he shows a turbid near bottom layer and shows it as being kind of transported along with ambient currents. And when we have energetic storms come through, then we might resuspend that sediment back up into the boundary layer. So the idea when Don wrote this book and made this figure was that the main processes that were controlling the transport of material was suspended transport. This slide over here that I modified from Tarkovsky and Geyer shows similar stuff. We've got a river putting sediment in. Once that river hits the salt water, we're going to have material settling out of it towards the near bed. But then they added in a new process, which is downslope gravity flows. And that's because field evidence showed us that, that when we had resuspension, we could build up very thin near bed sediment layers that would have enough of an added density to flow downslope. And so a big cross-shelf transport mechanism is these, they labeled them as turbidity currents in the figure, but they can also be waves, like a lot of times called wave-supported gravity flows. So the main, the main addition in this figure is we've still got sediment being transported by a long shelf currents and by freshwater plumes delivering material to the bed or to the coastal ocean, but we have an added process, which is a downslope gravity flow. So the goal of our numerical modeling of sediment transport over the past couple decades has really been to develop three-dimensional numerical models that can account for these suspended processes as well as gravity flow processes. And if we're going to look at the behavior of muds and fine-grained particles in the coastal ocean, we also need to account for cohesive processes such as flocculation and then also bed consolidation of how the muddy beds become harder to erode with time. So towards that goal of developing these numerical models for sediment transport, I've worked within, in the most recent 10 years, I've done most of my work within the coupled ocean atmosphere wave sediment transport system. So that we call that COAST. And I've liked working within that group because it allows me to kind of focus on the sediment transport and the coastal ocean, while some colleagues are working on the coupling between the ocean and the atmospheric part, and also the ocean and the waves part. So in my own research, this system, COAST, coupled ocean atmosphere wave sediment transport, includes components for all of those things. It uses ROMS for the ocean model. It uses WRF for the atmospheric model, SWAN for the wave model, and what I call the Cstms for the sediment transport model. Most of the work within my group has used, of course, the ocean model of ROMS, the Cstms model for sediment, and then some of my applications, we've also included the wave modeling of SWAN. So now I want to show you a little bit more about how the sediment transport model is developed. So I call it the Cstms sediment transport modeling system. And it's really, when I use that phrase, I'm referring to a model that was published by John Warner in 2008. So within this sediment transport model, it accounts for suspended sediment transport. And it also makes the assumption that the sediment is behaving non-cohesively. So that means that it's appropriate for sands that don't have cohesive properties. And it's really assuming that the sediment properties are sort of fixed and a function of grain size. So for a non-cohesive sediment model, we assign each of our types of sediment a settling velocity and also a critical shear stress for erosion. And those are assumed to be kind of fixed properties. They can vary with grain size in the model or with sediment type, but they don't vary as a function of other things like turbulence or the age of the sediment bed. So the Cstms model has been used in literally hundreds of different applications. There are, this paper has been cited hundreds of times, and it is the Cstms model comes standard with the ROMS, Regional Ocean Model Distribution. And so it's available for people worldwide to use for their applications. I'm going to highlight one of the most recent applications from my group, which was to use the Cstms to look at dispersal offshore of the Irrawaddy Delta. So to get you a little bit acquainted with where this is in the world, the Irrawaddy is a large river that drains the Himalayas and comes into kind of the south, I guess I would call it the southeastern side of the Bay of Bengal. So the project that we looked at, that we worked on, studied this area here in the southern, south of the Irrawaddy Delta, and also to the east of the Irrawaddy Delta. And there are two rivers that feed a lot of sediment into this area. That's the Irrawaddy River as well as the Thanlwin. So those two rivers combined end up providing a massive source of both sediment and carbon to the coastal oceans. And they rank, when you combine their discharges, they rank as some of the top global sources of both sediment and carbon to the coastal ocean. And so that's one reason that we were interested in looking at this system. We had an NSF project that was funded with Steve Keel and Paul Liu, and that allowed Steve and Paul to do field work in 2017. And a lot of the motivation for doing this project wasn't just the fact that this is a huge global source of sediment and carbon, but also it was the last large global source of these materials to the coastal ocean that really hadn't been studied. And then another motivation was that in a lot of global scale pictures of things like ocean productivity, this area kind of points out as a kind of a hotspot. So this slide over here is based on an Earth system model, a global model, and it's showing calculations of surface chlorophyll. And this area, probably because it has such a large input of carbon and nutrients to the coastal ocean, and also because, as you'll see, it's very energetic in forms of tidal energy, this area turns out to be kind of a global hotspot for productivity. And yet we really, until this field program, we really didn't have an idea of what the sediment deposition rates were there and what the thicknesses of sediment deposition over time scales ranging. We just had very limited data of what the sedimentary environment was offshore of these major river sources. So as I said, in December of 2017, Steve Keel and Paul Liu led a field cruise, research cruise, where they went offshore of the Irrawaddy Delta, and they took lots of sediment cores. So each of these red dots over here is one of the sediment coring locations. And they also did chirp seismic. So each of the black lines on this grid are where they ran the chirp to get an idea of the way the sediment was deposited and accumulating throughout the Holocene. And based on that field data, they came up with this image. So this is showing the lead to tin estimated accumulation rates. And you're seeing that, that there's a kind of a major depot center here, which they've identified as a cliniform feature. And then the deposition kind of tails off as we move away from that. and that there wasn't really much accumulation in this Gulf of Martaban. But the sediment cores showed that there was a lot of mixing in that area. And when we looked at what was going on hydrodynamically, so a goal of our work, of my group's work, was to try to relate this process, this kind of picture of deposition, where accumulation offshore of the Gulf of Martaban area. And so we started thinking about what the likely sediment transport processes were there. And we there's been an idea in the literature that due to the Asian monsoon climate, that we have really different dispersal mechanisms during the summertime when they have the southwest monsoon and the wintertime when they have the northeast monsoon. So this plot here shows a time series of average conditions with each one of these being 1 month. And then the data was taken from global data sources that we had that spanned decades. And so we see that during the summer months, we tend to have strong winds from the south. And we also, this blue line is the estimate of the discharges from the river. So these strong winds from the south tend to bring rain, which tends to feed the discharge from the rivers, and also the snow melt from the mountains gives us our discharge peak in the summer months, as well as our peak in energy, because we have our strong onshore winds in the summer months. Then in the winter months, the climate changes and we have the northeast monsoon, during which times we have offshore winds, low wave energy, and also low input from the rivers. And so on this plot, in red are the surface currents during the southwest monsoon. And so we see that during the southwest monsoon, we expect to have material coming into the Gulf of Martaban. The blue is what was thought would be the surface currents during the northeast monsoon. So the idea was that during the northeast monsoon, we would export material from the Gulf of Martaban. During the southwest monsoon, we would import material into it. And then another thing that we knew about this site is that the tides are very energetic. So this is a plot of tidal amplitude from a 2013 paper showing that the tide amplitudes exceed 5 meters and that they're especially energetic along the eastern edge of this study area. So then our group worked on trying to relate the sediment deposition and mixing patterns based on what we knew about the physical oceanography. So again, here, this is the isopack thicknesses from the Holocene record, again, showing this maximum deposition offshore of the Gulf of Martaban. And this was our conceptual vision about what was happening in the study site, that we would have intense sediment mixing in the Gulf of Martaban because the tides are so strong here, and that we might have bidirectional seasonally driven transport, either importing material during the southwest monsoon or exporting it during the northeast monsoon. So in order to test those ideas, we set up a coupled wave hydrodynamic and sediment transport model. So this was done by my master's student, Matt Fair, and this is the model grid that Matt developed. And then he ran the model for an energetic summer monsoon period in August and a less energetic winter monsoon period for January. And he wanted to look at whether the deposition and dispersal showed temporal signals. Was the seasonal signal big, or was a tidal signal? And he also wanted to look at the spatial differences in transport in terms of both east to west and the difference in transport within the Gulf of Martaban compared to offshore of the Gulf of Martaban. This is a schematic of what Matt put into his model. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to highlight that, he had to come up with an initial sediment bed. And I felt like that was one of our biggest uncertainties in our model. And then he used global models to force his boundary conditions and also to specify his wind. And then here are some of his model results. So on the left-hand side is the spring tide range that Matt got from his model. And then over here on the right, there's really not much data available, but Matt did find a tide gauge at this point here. And on the right is showing the the modeled in red and the measurement from the tide gauge in the black line. And then on the bottom is how well the model did, just comparing the two. And so that's not as good of a data validation as we would like, but it is what we were able to do with the limited data that we could get our hands on. And so now I want to look at the variability in currents that were predicted by the model. So the top panels here show the model calculations averaged over a spring neap cycle for the southwest monsoon conditions. So in this model run, the winds are blowing from the southwest. Now, each of the arrows on here, the red arrows here, that's the time averaged current. But then the ellipses that are around that time average, that's the variability of the current. And if you can see, Matt Fair made this figure, and he used this scale bar here for 25 centimeters per second for the average current. But for the variability, the scale bar of the same size is 2 meters per second. So the variability is way bigger than the mean, okay? And in the Gulf of Martaban, the variability is tidal. It's going in and out with the tides, with the ebb and the flood tides. The panel on the left is the surface currents, and the panel on the right is the bottom currents. So the surface currents are doing what we thought they would do during the seasonal event of importing material into the Gulf of Martaban, and the bottom currents are weaker, but they're also directed into the Gulf of Martaban. Then when Matt ran the model for Northeast conditions, again, the little red arrows would be the time averaged currents, and the ellipses are the variability. So the variability is much bigger compared to the mean currents in the Northeast monsoon compared to how it was in the Southwest monsoon, because the mean currents are much smaller, or pretty much smaller in the Northeast monsoon. But an interesting thing was that during the Northeast monsoon, we do have export of material at the surface, but our bottom currents are still importing material. So this picture that we had of bidirectional transport due to the seasons didn't really pan out, because most of our sediment is in these bottom currents, and we're not exporting that sediment out to the Bay of Bengal during our Northeast monsoon, because on average, our bottom sediments are still coming eastward. And then looking again at seasonal patterns in transport, the top row shows the wave height with the color, and the winds as the blue arrows. The bottom panels show the suspended sediment concentrations that were calculated for the Northeast model and the Southwest monsoon model. And so what's striking is that, yeah, there is more energy in the system during the Southwest monsoon, but the patterns of turbidity really don't look that much different. We still have a muddy Gulf of Martaban area. The concentrations were higher during Southwest monsoon, but the extent of the feature really didn't vary. And so in summary of that, when we look at the bed shear stresses, we see that yes, conditions are so energetic in the Gulf of Martaban. It's driven by tides, so we don't get a seasonal difference. But when we look at the difference over the spring neap cycle, we do get a big difference. So here, Matt Fair took his model runs over a spring tide cycle and a neap tide cycle, and he got really drastic differences in the extent of their turbidity. And it turns out that that matches up with what has been seen in satellite data, that the spring tides tend to have sediment at much further offshore than the neap tides. And then I wanted to make sure that this wasn't just kind of a one-off thing. So we went and looked at satellite data for a longer period. Now, we could only get satellite data for the Northeast monsoon conditions because during the Southwest monsoon conditions, it's too cloudy to get this type of imagery. But here's an example of what we found in the satellite record. So the red time series on the bottom is just showing us the timing of the spring tides compared to the neap tides. And then for each of these points with the blue line, that is when we were able to get a satellite image. So these two on the left, these line up with neap tide conditions, and the two on the right line up with spring tide conditions. So to summarize this study of the Irrawaddy Shelf, we see that the tidal processes are what's important, more so than what we found for the seasonal processes. Our sediment concentrations are really high in the Gulf of Martaban because they're constantly being mixed by energetic tides. The seasonal differences, I think, are more due to sediment supply than they are to the forcing by the winds and the waves. And so we haven't published this modeling results yet. We're working now on trying to fine tune it up and write it up for publication. But one of our guiding questions was, how can we relate these sediment processes to biogeochemistry? And so what we did with that study that I just showed you was we linked the ROMS hydrodynamic model to the community sediment transport model. But that doesn't allow us to directly say how the sediment is impacting the biogeochemistry. So some other work that my group has done, especially in the northern Gulf of Mexico, is to try to more directly couple our sediment transport models to biogeochemical models. And so I'm going to show, time permitting, I'm going to show examples of how we relate sediment transport to oxygen consumption. This bottom panel is showing a map of the 2017 dead zone, or the layer, the extent of hypoxia or low oxygen concentrations. And a big field of study has been trying to relate the nutrient output from the Mississippi River and the oceanographic forcing to the extent of this dead zone each summer. And then another project that we worked on was linking our sediment transport model to an oil dispersal model. So this panel here shows the footprint of sedimented oil that was mapped out after the Deepwater Horizon event. And so in the past 10 years or so, my research group has worked on coupling our sediment transport to both of these problems, to the biogeochemistry that creates hypoxia, as well as how we form oil sediment aggregates that then can settle to the seafloor as a sink of oil contamination. So the first part that we worked on was trying to link our sediment transport model and be able to use something about the sediment transport model to relate sedimentary processes to nutrient remineralization and hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. So my group started out working on this by developing a sediment transport model that was published by Kevin Hsu in 2011. And we built our sediment transport model from a physical oceanographic model that Rob Hetland had developed. And when we published this, we kind of made some arguments that the area where we have hypoxia tended to be the area where we didn't have very high suspended sediment concentrations, but that we had deposition of sediment. At the same time as we were developing our sediment transport model, Katja Fennell's group was using the same physical oceanographic model to develop a coupled physical and biological model. But at this point, we hadn't linked the sediment processes to the biogeochemical processes. And one of the conclusions of Fennell's paper, her 2011 paper, was that the sediment oxygen demand and the ways in which the model characterizes sediment oxygen demand was kind of a really important piece of the model, and also pretty poorly constrained. So that motivated us to work on trying to link the sediment transport model and the water column biogeochemical model. And this was part of the dissertation work of Julia Moriarty. And Julia attacked this problem by adding a diagenesis component to our sediment transport model. So she added the Sodert biogeochemical model for the seabed, and then that model was able to link the nutrient components that come out of the water column biogeochemical model into a sediment bed diagenesis. And so I'm going to show you some of the results from Julia's work. But what her model included, so we called this model HydroBioSed because it incorporates both the hydrodynamics, the biogeochemical cycling, as well as the sediment bed dynamics. And so this includes erosion and deposition of organic matter and sediment. It accounts for the resuspension and then redistribution of organic matter. So if particulate organic matter settles to the seabed, it can be re-eroded and it can be remineralized either in the seabed or in the water column. It accounts for light attenuation. When we resuspend sediment, that impacts the light attenuation in the water. And then once the organic matter does settle to the bed, it can be stored there and buried there and remineralized in the seabed. The decomposition of organic matter does in the seabed, and oxidation of reduced chemical species are incorporated in the seabed so that the model can build up anoxic pore water. And then when we have an erosion event, that anoxic pore water can be re-injected up into the water column. So it accounts for fluxes across the seabed water interface, both as a diffusive flux and also as an episodic flux when we have a resuspension or a deposition event. So this work was published in JGR a few years ago, and this is showing the model grid and kind of a schematic table of what we included. We had Moriarty's sediment HydroBioSed, the sediment model from Xu, the biogeochemical model from Katja Fennell's group, and the physical oceanography going back to Hetland's model. And so here's some slides from the model output. The left-hand side is the forcing time series. So Julia Moriarty ran the model for about a 2-year time period and analyzed the model results during the summer when hypoxia is at the peak. The right-hand panel here on the top is the bed shear stress calculated by the model, and the bottom panel is the frequency of resuspension. So we see that in the area where we tend to have hypoxia here is where we're having kind of this decrease in resuspension. Now here, Julia Moriarty ran the model 2 different ways. First, she ran it with the fully coupled model, including resuspension. And that gave these calculations for the particulate organic carbon in the water, the net remineralization rate occurring in the water, and then the oxygen concentrations. So we see that we're building up a low oxygen hypoxic layer near the bed in this model that included the resuspension. But then she ran the model again and did not include resuspension. So she ran the model more like a standard biogeochemical model is run. And then the panels here show the difference between the model that had resuspension and the model that didn't. And so wherever it's blue, that means the model that had resuspension had more of that stuff in the water column. Where it's red, that means that resuspension reduced the amount of that stuff in the water column. So what we see is that resuspension increases the amount of organic carbon and increases the remineralization rate, which then acts to decrease the amount of oxygen in the water and exacerbates hypoxia. And then the last example that I think I have time to show you is work that we did more recently, where we're working to try to couple the sediment transport behavior to the fate of an oil contaminant. And so this work was done as part of the CSOMIO consortium. It's called the Consortium for Oil Microbial Interactions in the Ocean. And it was an effort that was led at Florida State. So my group worked on the sediment transport model. And then we had other people working on the hydrodynamics. And then a group from Horn Point worked on the water column biogeochemistry. The group at Florida State led, most of the model development was done by Dmitry Dukovsky, added an oil model to ROMS. And then we coupled the oil model with sediment so that when we had oil in the water column and sediment, it could aggregate and form oil particle aggregates that then would settle towards the seabed and produce kind of a sink term for the oil. So here's a couple of figures from papers that came out earlier this year. And this schematic up here is a schematic of how we accounted for the aggregation between oil and sediment particles. When they aggregate, they form what we call oil particle aggregates. And the details of how we did the model are in this paper by Lin Shui. And then the larger coupled model took our OPA model and used it to try to account for the importance of these oil particle aggregates in the fate of oil from an oil spill. And so these maps here are from the fully coupled 3D model showing the concentration and formation of these oil particle aggregates. And so to summarize, the work we've done in the Gulf of Mexico is, we're still working within a community modeling system. So that has allowed us to focus our efforts on the sediment parts of the model, but take advantage of the biogeochemical and the oil model that was also developed within the same sediment transport and physical oceanography, try to think of such as water quality and hypoxia. And also there's, in this figure, all of the green areas are active lease areas. So the ability to better predict the fate of oil contaminants in the Gulf of Mexico is still a really timely thing. And we're interested in trying to continue our efforts to kind of holistically account for the fate of oil. And then I'm just going to close by pointing out that all of the models I showed so far assumed that our sediment was non-cohesive, but in a lot of our estuary and continental shelf environments, cohesive processes are important because we have muds and clays there. So for cohesive sediment, they're going to undergo flocculation, by which their settling velocities change. And then also when they settle to the bed, they're going to undergo consolidation, by which their erodibility changes with time. And so my group has been working on trying to account for these processes by using a different version of the Cstms, using a version that came out in 2018. And the development was led by Chris Sherwood. And within that version of the model, we do account for active flocculation processes and bed consolidation. So here's the citation for the paper that describes the cohesive model. So most of the time, if you see ROM's sediment transport models in the literature, they're going to be using the non-cohesive, but this cohesive model is now available for use in muddy environments. And then this is a figure of from Danielle Tarpley, who got her PhD from VIMS in 2020. So Danielle included these cohesive processes in a model of an idealized estuary. And what she saw, so the top panel is suspended sediment concentration. The middle panel is the shear rate, showing how energetic the mixing is. And the bottom panel is the settling velocity. So since we're allowing our particles to form aggregates and break up, then we tend to have parts of the estuary where we have flocks forming and they have big settling velocities. And then other parts of the estuary, we have small settling velocities because either the flocks were broken up or they were never able to be formed in the first place. So we're working on trying to write Danielle's research up for publication, but a big theme in it is that the downstream edge is, the downstream part of the estuary is very different from the ETM because the Estuarine Turbidity Maximum is the area where we have the most energy and also the highest sediment concentrations. So that tended to be the area where, in our case, we were forming the flocks. So now just my closing thoughts. I hope I've shown you some examples of how we've used advancements in ocean models to look at interdisciplinary and larger scale work for the coastal ocean, and especially focusing on the sedimentary systems. I tried to highlight examples from depositional and reworking offshore the Irrawaddy, and oxygen consumption and contaminant transport in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Our current research includes trying to account better for these flocculation and consolidation processes, or the cohesive processes, and doing more work to couple sediment and contaminant transport. And then also, we were recently funded to work on a project where we will be looking at how we can relate estuarine water quality to upstream drivers. So over the summer, I was funded for 2 projects. One is to look at coupling the sediment transport to contaminant transport during large storms, and the other is to try to look at an estuarine system and do it more source to sink, so that we're working with hydrologists who are specifying the inputs from the upstream and trying to communicate those upstream inputs into how they impact water quality downstream. So that is what I had for my talk. I apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but thank you for your attention.
Courtney, that was really great. I mean, fantastically interesting examples of the interactions of physical, biological, and chemical processes, and the ability now, which you are spearheading, to quantify those processes in 3-dimensional models. It's really wonderful to see these advances. So we open it up for questions now from participants.
I have a question. I am not particularly well versed in modeling or like systems like this, but you mentioned earlier that someone was running a model for approximately 2 years. Does that mean that they were running the model as in like working it for 2 years, or that they ran a model to like estimate a time period of 2 years?
Yeah. Well, she worked on it probably more than 2 years, but yeah, she was. So what I meant was that she was representing a time period of 2 years. So here's the time series that she ran. But that's a good question, because a lot of times so she ran this model of the Gulf of Mexico to represent 2 years, from January 2006 to January 2008. The actual model run itself probably took a couple of weeks to run. She was running it on an HPC, a high performance computer here at VIMS, and it probably took about 10 days to represent the full 2 years. So then it probably took her longer than 2 years to do the work, because every time you want to change something in the model, that's another 10 days before you get the results back.
And is that something that would be like specific for that time period of like 2000, I don't know if you said 2006 to 2008 or 2008 to 10, but like, is that something that you could theoretically pick up and use 5 years, like to estimate 5 years later? Or is that something that's specific to that time period because of all of the key factors that took so long to like put in place?
Yeah. So her results are really specific to these 2 years, because that's what she ran it for. But when we set up a model, one thing we try to do is pick years that are representative. So or maybe you want to look at what happened during a big storm, and then you would pick, a year that had a big storm. But for this, I think they tried to pick a year that was pretty dry. So 2006, I didn't have, this is the river discharge. I think they wanted to pick a year that was dry, and then a year that was a summer following a wet year, to look at, because the nutrient inputs would be different those 2 years. But if you wanted to say, run it for a different time period, maybe you want to see what would have happened during Hurricane Katrina, so you wanted to run 2005, the model and the processes in the model should be valid for then. You would need to do extra work to develop the input files for the wind forcing and the nutrient inputs and riverine inputs. So.
I've got a question, if you don't mind, Bob.
Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. Has anyone looked into the impacts of the forecasted changes in the monsoon system that are expected as a result of anthropogenic climate influences, the role of kind of really everything that's being looked at in your models? And similarly, on a much longer time scale, how is anyone playing with looking at long-term variations in the monsoon system and its impacts on, say, chemical weathering into the system?
I can't speak to the chemical weathering point, but I have been I've been proposing to try to look at how changes to the monsoon system would impact dispersal offshore the Irrawaddy. And the way that I've proposed to do that is to use the historical record that gives us kind of a population of different types of events that impact the system, and then run the model for those different types of scenarios, and then use what the climate scientists are telling us they project, how they project the monsoonal and the typhoon to change in the coming centuries, and then try to, once we use a model to run different historical events and get a sense for how the system responds to those historical events, and then say we think that in the future we're going to have more typhoons that come from the east, or we're going to have a weaker southwest monsoon, then we could use the results from that historical record to try to see what we think the impacts will be of those shifts in climate going forward. That's how I would approach it with the tools I have, because my models run on time steps of a couple of minutes. And so I can hope, I can't really run longer than a couple of years time frame at a reasonable computational cost.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me? My name is Bob. I have some questions. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, it's a great talk. Yeah, so I have some questions about your study in the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, I spent 1 year there to study the carbon cycling and oxygen consumption. So have you thought about the contribution of stratification to the oxygen consumption instead of in addition to the sediment resuspension? So I saw some interesting things. Yeah, so yeah.
So stratification from the temperature and salinity?
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, so those processes are included in the hydrodynamic model. So to the extent that the hydrodynamic model can reproduce the heating in the surface layers and the salinity stratification from the river plume, yeah, those are included. And that kind of has a big impact on, that has an impact on these spatial patterns that we see in the oxygen here, with the low oxygen kind of being under the areas over here where we have the stratification from the fresh water.
Yeah, so based on what I see at the
those processes are in the model. We for our study, my group focused on trying to constrain the sediment oxygen demand part, and other people in our study were looking at the impact of stratification.
Yeah, so based on what I saw and see, so if there was hypoxia at the bottom, so when a strong wind event occurred, so we can see the whole water column get oxygenated, and then the hypoxia is gone. But once the certification is rebuilt, so the hypoxia comes back very quickly in a couple of days. So it gives me a sense, the water mixing just can oxygenate the water column very quickly. This is the first point. The second is based on what I saw during the cruise. So only the bottom water has high suspension from the turbidity data. Another thing is, I saw just a jet of high turbid water from near shore to offshore areas. So it gives me a sense that might be the source of organic matter which can be decomposed to consume oxygen, might be from the near shore area instead of from along the west-east side.
Mhm.
That's my guess and my feeling.
And this, I didn't take time to go through this figure on the right-hand side, but this kind of is similar to some of the points you're making, but from the model. So here, this is cross-shore transects calculated by the model for the POC, the oxygen consumption rate, and then the oxygen concentrations. And so these are taken before a storm wave event, right after a storm wave event, and then as the wave event kind of goes down and relaxes. So we see at the peak of the wave event, we're putting a lot of POC in the water column through resuspension, and then that is causing oxygen consumption to peak in this bottom boundary layer and draw down oxygen. And then as the waves die out, that kind of bottom boundary layer sediment signal kind of shifts offshore.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Courtney, I have a question, if I can get in here. I don't see any other hands up at this point. I'm wondering if the models can resolve the kinds of features that you could see in some of the satellite photos off the Bay of Martaban, where you see swirls of low turbidity water, high chlorophyll water embedded within the bay, surrounded by high turbidity brown water. So you get high chlorophyll, clearer water pools and swirls in there. Do you see that in the models, or do you just, the models patterns you showed tended to be more sort of regular gradients and things? Do you see those swirls?
Yeah, and a lot of the figures I showed were also the time averaged figures. And so, so this is averaged over a couple of hours at peak tide, okay? Or this might have been averaged over a tidal cycle. But when we look at the instant snapshots, we do get like features like this little bump here. We do get features. They don't match one-to-one, of course, but we do get tendrils of stuff coming out. For these figures, we averaged over time. So then the features average out. But the model's not resolving chlorophyll, so we wouldn't have high chlorophyll water, but we have high salinity water.
I'm just wondering what the characteristic resonance time of those little pools and swirls might be when they're embedded in there. Are we talking about a day or?
Well, not that, I mean, the
hours?
tides are so energetic. I think it would be shorter than the ebb to flood tide time scale.
Okay.
I think. Yeah.
Great. I see, Jack, your hand's up.
Hi, Courtney.
Hi.
Just a quick question. So can you comment on Danielle's work about the flocculation, including flocculation processes in the estuary? And what's your conclusion from that work? Do you think that this is a process that we really have to be resolving and including to get the estuarine ETM dynamics correct?
I don't think we need it to get the ETM in the right place. Like, we still get the ETM in the right place if we don't have sediment aggregating and disaggregating. But I think that, if I can remember, I felt like what we needed to get what's happening downstream of it, like, I'm sorry. So here in the ETM, we're putting a lot of stuff up in the water column and it's flocculating. And so it's kind of staying there. But when we get over the stuff that we're getting up in the surface waters was all disaggregated stuff. So if you're interested in the light attenuation, you really need to be accounting for that disaggregated material. And in the case that we ran, we modeled our dynamics after we tried to make them representative of the York River, because that's where we had the most data. And there the energies are kind of lower than we'd see in other estuaries. And it seemed like the dynamics of we were only getting kind of a lower end of the dynamics. So I don't know if I can answer very well at this time, but
thank you.
We saw really different flocculation processes happening in the ETM from downstream. In the ETM, it was all about forming the flocks, and in the downstream, it was the concentrations were low and flocks were breaking up.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So Courtney, there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you can read it. Do you have access?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so question is, the spatial resolution of the ROMS and sediment transport model for the Gulf of Mexico, I'm pretty sure that was about a 2 kilometer scale model, 1 to 2 kilometer scale in the horizontal and about 30 to 40 in the vertical.
So I have a question as well about that region. Are you able to incorporate storm surge and the movement of sediment onshore during storm surge in these kind of models?
With ROMS, the version of ROMS that I use doesn't account for turning land cells into water cells. So we can't flood a marsh in the version of ROMS that I use. But there are versions of ROMS that do account for that include wetting and drying. And so those have been used in those types of systems, but I don't have much experience with them. One of the projects that was recently funded is to look at storm surge processes using ROMS and coupling it to wharf hydro. And so the wharf hydro, so that's linking the precipitation river model with ROMS. And one reason we want to do that is to account for flooding from both storm surge and big precipitation rainfall events like we have seen in several recent hurricanes, right? So that's work that was funded this summer that we're gearing up, and I'll be working with people from LSU on that.
Really, really interesting. Are there any other questions out there? I can't see everybody at once, so I don't really know. Okay, I guess that's it for the audience. And Courtney, can you hang around for a minute afterwards? I just wanted to say a few things to you.
Okay. And I just want to thank you again for your patience at the beginning, and also especially thank my husband, Dave, for making it so I could do this talk at all. So.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay. One more chat.
There's some thank yous in the chat.
Yes. Great. Okay.
As people bail out here.
You're quickly down to 10, 11.
And people get bigger too as they disappear. They get bigger on my screen.
Well, I'll let you know if any of the students have constructive criticisms. They have to critique all these seminars in exchange for credit for coming.
They'll probably say she should have remembered to power up her computer.
Oh, no.
It stopped. It was plugged in all day, but the battery failed or something. It's not charging.
No, I'm just kidding you. I've had the same things happen. You know, when you have it plugged in and then it's dead as a doornail. When you go in to use it, it's
well, I think a lot of people are particularly interested in the Gulf of Mexico and the fact that it's not cooling off and it's so involved with these storms. So I think there was a lot of interest in your talk. So it's good. Okay, I'll let you guys talk. I won't hog any time. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Josie.
Bye.
See you tonight.
Courtney, I know everyone's very busy, but I just wanted to say hi and thank you for a really outstanding talk.
Thank you. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you too. We hope to have been under different circumstances when we would see each other again, maybe in different parts of the world, but you struck a great balance between all the details and the content that I think was accessible, and I've got a lot of questions too, but I have to run.
Okay.
So maybe we can catch up another time.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great talk. I would say thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm really interested in your study in the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, I was wondering the oxygen consumption rate at the bottom, which since we see so large area of hypoxia and almost anoxia. So so really I always think we should look into the stratification first. So if there's no stratification, so I don't think the resuspension of organic matter can consume so much oxygen. Since
yeah, you have to put a lid over the supply of oxygen. Yes.
Yeah, at least the depth, the thickness of the hypoxia, the layer of the hypoxia is almost 2 to 3 meters at the bottom. So that's a very large volume. So it's a very interesting topic to see how much carbon can be consumed, since we have already limited the input of nutrient to the Mississippi River and Atchafalaya River. So that's a very interesting question. So I would like to contact you in the future. So maybe we'll look into the more details.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have to run. Thank you very much for your great talk.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So Courtney, I'm wondering if anyone's ever applied these kinds of models to metals like manganese and iron, which are believed to sort of leapfrog their way in the system heading offshore, so that you get progressively greater fractionation of manganese and iron from other materials. And the reason I ask is because, in part, because there are data, for example, for the Gulf of Mexico, Mississippi Delta system that have been published on manganese in particular, that show the enrichment of particles as they move offshore. And there's a flux of reduced dissolved manganese from the disturbed sediments, as well as diffusive loss from the bottom, that then gets enhanced on the suspended particles, a small proportion of which presumably make it offshore and are enriched. Has anybody looked at that in a quantitative way in this context?
Yeah, not that I know of. So one thing we did when we made this model was, it was a big jump to go from sediment particles that are kind of inert to having tracers that act like sediment, but that go through reactions. So I called it adding a reactive term to the sediment model. And so to my knowledge, it hasn't been used for that type of issue. Like part of the project that was just funded with LSU, we're going to use the contaminant tracers to look, I think, at mercury contamination, because there was buried mercury in a hurricane exposed it. But yeah, I think that, I mean, we did our model development within the sediment transport model. And so I think we can use those reactive tracers. If people can say how to model the chemistry of that reactive tracer, we can use it for whatever reactive tracer we want, right?
Yeah, that would be really interesting. You know, in paleo reconstruction of anoxia, one of the things that's used is what's called the Iron Shuttle. It's sort of a qualitative idea that people have had for many years, actually going way back to a guy named Konrad Krauskopf, who was at the USGS in California, and talked about the the segregation of iron and manganese in the oceans, that manganese has a longer half-life in the water column before it back precipitates onto particles than iron. But in any case, there's this movement, this slow movement from the shoreline into the deep sea of iron and manganese and enrichment. And one of the things that people have talked about in the case of iron is that iron eventually ends up in anoxic basins like the Black Sea or something. And you can really see it being accumulated there, but I've never seen a quantitative description of this process.
One limit of our model might be the time scales. Like, since I'm resolving the storms and the tidal cycles and the winds, my time steps are like a minute. And so if we're talking about processes that are take longer than a decade, then this model wouldn't be the way to go.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think the processes would be multi-decadal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's interesting.
I think maybe putting some of these transport processes into a larger scale model might be an approach. But
yeah. Okay. Well, those were just little asides, I guess. I've been afraid to ask Hetty what the status of that. I've got to do it. I know what the answer is going to be, which is why I'm afraid of asking. But,
I asked MG&G. Did you hear that?
No.
MG&G sent me a request about a panel, and I said, "Oh, speaking of reviews, do you know about the Aller proposal?" And he said, and so it was, I'm so brain shot right now. Dan McGillicuddy, the guy from Woods Hole, Dan.
Yeah.
McCorkle. Dan said, well, he said, since that was led by Chem Osh, I can't comment on it.
Okay, I'll ask Hetty.
Yeah.
It's still listed as pending, which means they have not formally declined it. And it is quite possible that Hetty held it in the hopes that the political situation would change. But I think the handwriting's on the wall there. And so I'll get her to formally say something. I mean, I won't get her. I will ask her to do that. So
okay.
So,
yeah, it was really unfortunate.
Oh boy, I think it really is unfortunate because I personally think it was really well positioned and in many ways, scientifically and socially and culturally. And so it's kind of sad, but that's the way life is. So, okay, well, thank you again so much for doing this. I know it's a big swath of time out of your schedule, and I do appreciate it. And hopefully you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I hope it was decipherable from your end.
It was, and it actually helps me in my, I teach an intro graduate course, and everyone's always trying to see what the justification is for considering the seabed and in these systems. And so this is really great. I really appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to let you go. And thanks a lot.
Thank you. Have a good weekend. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.